Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
We're going back out west on today's episode to visit with one of our DU biologists, and this is a new guest on the show. We're going to welcome in Amelia Raquel, a DU biologist, and I'm not actually sure, Amelia, where you are located, so I'm going to just welcome you to the show, and then I'll ask you to tell us a bit more about where you are.
Okay, thanks for having me. I'm out in Susanville, California, so that's northeastern California on the east side of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. It's actually about an hour and a half north of Reno, Nevada, so almost right on the California-Nevada border.
One of the reasons why we have these episodes where we introduce, we have our DU staff or DU biologists come on, is we think there's value in having our listeners, our members and supporters kind of get to hear from the people that are actually in the field doing the habitat work that is so important to the organization and to the resource that we're providing for. You're one of those people that fall into that category, and so we appreciate your time and joining us. I want to give you the opportunity at the beginning here to introduce yourself in a bit more detail to our audience. So give us a brief rundown on your personal background, your career background, and then what you do for Ducks Unlimited out in California.
So I'm originally from California, the Central Valley, kind of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta region. Grew up hunting there, and that's kind of where my passion for waterfowl and wildlife came from. I have an undergraduate degree from University of California, Davis, and then I went on to the University of Saskatchewan in Canada, and I have a master's degree from there. Studied nesting waterfowl up there in relation to land use and kind of some climate indices up there. Prior to working for DU, I was actually back kind of in my hometown, working on an island in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta that was managed primarily for sandhill cranes, wintering sandhill cranes and other waterfowl. And that was for a subsidiary of the Nature Conservancy. So I've been with DU now for about a year and a half. I am a regional biologist, so my region covers Klamath Basin into southern Oregon, all of northeastern California and Nevada, and I do a lot of on-the-ground habitat delivery projects. I work with an engineering counterpart, so I do a lot of the grant writing and project development, working with landowners and wildlife area refuge managers to develop, kind of what projects we think would be good, and then the engineer kind of takes that, does the technical survey design and construction management to put those projects on the ground.
Okay, thank you. We'll probably get into a few details of the type of projects that you work on there, but I want to connect a couple of dots here for some of our listeners that might have listened to, might have tuned in to previous episodes. We had Matt Kaminsky, a biologist from the Central Valley of California, on a few episodes ago, as well as Mark Biddlecombe, the Director of Operations for the Western region. So you are within the Western region, you're part of that staff, and you're I point that out just so people begin to see that we have different people within the region stationed at different locations and that's important because you want to there's some efficiency to be gained by being close to where the habitat work is, and you get to understand and know the partners a bit better. Anyway, just wanted to help folks make some connections there with some of the other guests that we have. You and Matt Kaminsky have some similar roles and responsibilities, but you're just located in different areas, different sites of the Western region. So with that, I think we'll transition to a bit more about where you work, the type of the specific area where your work responsibilities fall. And you've referenced it, and it's Southern Oregon and Northeastern California, and frequent readers of the magazine or people familiar with waterfowl conservation out west might recognize the acronym SONEC, SONEC. It's the acronym for that region that I just mentioned. Amelia, I have to tell you that I grew up in the South, and first time I heard someone talking about SONEC, I obviously thought about the drive-in fast food chain that's all over the southern states. I don't know exactly how far it goes, but that's not exactly the SONEC that we're talking about here, is it?
No. So the SONEC region, it's actually split in half kind of in terms of on the ground biology responsibility. So I have a counterpart that covers a lot of the Oregon side outside of the Klamath Basin. So I cover Klamath, northeastern California, so that's kind of like Shasta, Modoc, Lassen counties. And then going into Nevada is actually kind of considered part of SONEC in some regard. So SONEC is continentally important migration landscape for fall and spring migration. I think something like 80% of the Pacific flyway waterfowl population goes through SONEC either in the fall or spring. It's pretty snowmelt driven system. So we get all our precipitation in the fall, winter, and then, spring runoff fills all our kind of terminal basins and shallow lakes. And then those are really important habitats for the migrating waterfowl.
So within that region, for the people that aren't familiar with it, and again, you and I have talked before, and I believe I've mentioned in our conversations that I've never set foot within the SONEC region. I've seen pictures and read about it, but what are the dominant habitat types? Like, what type of wetlands are we talking about, and what combination of public-private managed or public-private ownership of those wetlands are we really dealing with in that area?
Yeah, so kind of an intermountain type habitat. So there's, small mountain ranges interspersed with kind of big wet meadow systems. And the majority of the habitat is privately owned on working ranches. So it's big ranch country. I think there's about 5 different public refuges or wildlife areas that I work with in my region, and those are interspersed. But the majority of the habitat is privately owned. I think something like 70% of the wetlands in this region are privately owned.
Give people a brief idea of what the wetlands on those ranches look like, and specifically what I'm thinking about, and I believe this applies to the SONEC region, the spring flooding, the flood irrigated lands. Those are prominent within the SONEC region, correct?
Yeah.
Tell people what that is. When we say flood irrigated ranch lands in the spring and their importance for waterfowl, like what is that? What's flood irrigation for people back east or anywhere in the U.S. that may not be familiar with what's going on out there?
In the springtime, there's a lot of rivers and springs and, small perennial streams. And a lot of that has been developed in some regard on these meadows. So these ranchers typically, put in irrigation structures and help raise the water table in those meadows and kind of sheet flood that water outside of those stream banks onto the meadow to irrigate that.
So when we say flood irrigation, it's kind of literally what that is, rather than like the center pivot or some other kind of source of irrigation or mechanism of irrigation. It's actually this really shallow water across these vast meadows, grassy meadows, right? And it's irrigated to stimulate the growth of the forage, which ranching, and that provides the food for the cattle. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, and that's so that's a springtime deal, and in the fall, what are we? Is much of that habitat on the ranch land available in the fall, or during the fall, or the waterfowl more dependent on the intensively managed wetlands that might be predominantly on public lands?
Yeah, most of the working ranches irrigate in the springtime, and then they dry up to either hay or graze for the fall and winter. So most of those lands are dry during the fall, winter. So the primary habitat for migrating waterfowl and other water birds is on those public lands, which are more intensively managed wetland properties.
You've mentioned this already a bit, Amelia, but I want to dive into a bit more detail on it. The primary source of the water for those intensively managed wetlands on the public land, as well as in the spring, when we're talking about the flood irrigation water, is snowmelt. And so describe that. And it's not snowmelt necessarily from the fall of, let's say, 2019. When we're talking about wetland management that occurs in the fall of 2019, it's not, the source of that water is not snow that necessarily falls in the fall of 2019. It comes from like in the spring and summer, back in the spring and winter of the previous year, right?
Yeah, a lot of the time. So most of our precipitation occurs in the winter. And then as it warms up, that snowmelt and, fill some of these basins and things like that. But so a lot of the wildlife areas and refuges, and just outside of that where they get that water, a lot of them are part of bigger irrigation kind of systems. There tend to be reservoirs where they, hold all that water and then kind of slowly release it as they need it for those irrigators during the spring, and then later on in the fall when that water is not being used for agriculture.
I want to talk briefly here about waterfowl. And you mentioned that the SONEC region is primarily important and continentally important, given its connection to the Central Valley during autumn and spring as a migration stopover site. Do you have birds hanging around in the SONEC throughout the winter, or does it get so cold there, being in the Intermountain area, that all those wetlands freeze up? What's the residency pattern of waterfowl during the winter?
There aren't a lot of waterfowl that winter here because it does freeze up, but sometimes, if it gets warm, it'll thaw, and those birds from the Central Valley will come back up and hang out for a little while, and then it might freeze again, and they'll go back down to the Central Valley. So it's not a huge wintering area, but if it does warm up enough and those wetlands open up, then they'll come back. Do
you have many waterfowl there now, or is this one of the years where has it frozen by now?
It's pretty much frozen. It's been pretty cold recently, so I think most of the birds are in the valley at this point.
And with respect to the birds, what species come through there in greatest numbers? Which species is that region most important for?
Definitely the northern pintail in terms of migration. I think something like 80% or more come through here.
The Ducks Unlimited Expo, May 15th, 16th, and 17th, 2020 at the Texas Motor Speedway in Fort Worth, Texas. Interactive villages, shooting, archery, dogs, fishing, kayak, canoe, 4x4 off-road tracks, ATV, UTV track, industry experts, demonstrations, exhibitors, and more. The Ducks Unlimited Expo, everything outdoors. The ultimate playground for the outdoor enthusiast. The Ducks Unlimited Expo. Visit www.duckexpo.com.
Our work, what we do as an organization, really everywhere we work, is designed to address the things that are most challenging and that are most limiting to our ability to provide and manage quality wetlands that support waterfowl. So we always think about what are the greatest challenges within a given region that are either limiting the availability of wetland habitats or preventing us from maximizing their productivity. So within the SONEC region, what are those key challenges for wetland conservation and wetland management?
SONEC is, in an arid region, so water is kind of the most limiting factor for wetlands here. So a lot of what we do is related to water availability, water conveyance, and water use efficiency, especially on some of these public wildlife areas and refuges. So a lot of what we are doing is trying to, provide infrastructure for these managers to use what water they do have as efficiently as they can to be able to provide as much habitat as they can with, the limited water supplies that they may be getting. So a lot of these refuges and wildlife areas are tied to kind of complex irrigation systems that provide water kind of, most of them throughout, entire basin or valley. And so there's water rights associated with those things. And all of this kind of depends on what kind of water year we get. So, a few years ago, we were in a pretty bad drought. And then in the past couple of years, we've had, amazing water years. So it's all, very dynamic depending on what precipitation we may get in that given year.
What you described there sounds a lot like some of the work that I was familiar with that occurs along in coastal Texas. Coastal Texas is one of those rice-producing regions, and the availability of water for rice irrigation and then subsequent flooding during the winter is It sounds similar to what you're describing there. And so when you're talking about, Ducks Unlimited can't make more water. We can't make more water fall from the sky. None of our partners can either. Yeah, but what we can do is increase the efficiency of the use of that water, which is what you're talking about. That occurs in Texas and other regions as well, as I'm sure we'll talk about through time. And so on the surface, you might not think about some change to infrastructure for the management of water levels within a wetland as being highly valuable. But really, when you're competing for such a limited resource and such a valuable resource, that being water, anything that we can do to enhance the efficiency by which we use that water to manage wetlands for waterfowl goes a long way in helping us provide the resources and justify the continued use of that resource. So I'm a little familiar with what you're describing there, and so it definitely makes for some challenges and makes for some different types of approaches to wetland conservation. Amelia, are there any projects ongoing, recently completed, or planned habitat projects out in that region that are particularly noteworthy or that you would want to highlight here to share with our listeners?
Yeah, there's one project that I'm pretty excited about. It's still up and coming. We just broke the grant and heard that we've been selected for funding, so it'll be a year or two out. But it's a planning study to kind of look at the engineering feasibility and kind of environmental assessment of a huge water conveyance alternative system on Lower Klamath National Wildlife Refuge. So the majority of their water comes in through one intake from, the big irrigation system. And it currently has to flow through like about a 5,000 acre wetland and then another maybe 2,000 acre wetland until it can be used on any other unit on the refuge, which is kind of crazy to think about, especially in such a water limited region. So what we're going to look at is trying to find an alternative water conveyance system for them. So it might be a pipeline or a huge canal to basically bypass water going through those two units to be able to be used on basically every other unit on that refuge. So I think that's going to be a huge deal in the future, especially for water use efficiency.
Is there some on-the-ground work, some dirt moving, so to speak, that would be involved in that? Or is this just sort of an initial engineering and design working along the Gulf Coast? I know that engineering, the big thing that was an eye-opener to me is sometimes these engineering and design and feasibility studies can take 2 years or longer, and they become a project in themselves just because of all the complexities of the issue of moving water and the way it's regulated and everything else that comes along with it, especially in a coastal environment is vastly different because you're dealing with just a different system. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that these engineering and design studies, although on the surface you don't think, well, why do we need to spend that much money or why do we need to spend that much time doing all that? But that's the reality of what's involved in some of this. But so getting back to the project that you described, is there some dirt work, so to speak, that would be involved in this, or is it just sort of the feasibility element of it?
Right now, it's just the feasibility element of it. Because there's some different complications and just some different potential alternatives. So we need to kind of really figure out what is going to be the best solution and the less environmentally impacting solution. And then once we kind of come with that alternative, then we'll go try and, find money to implement the project. But ultimately, the goal is definitely to, put it on the ground.
What would you be looking at as a time frame for getting something, for implementing that? That's probably an impossible question, but I had to ask it anyway.
Yeah, so the money for the planning grant we probably won't have for about a year, and then that'll take at least a year to go through that whole process. And then it's really dependent on funding availability because this is probably going to be a pretty expensive project to implement. So, yeah, hard to say.
No, I'm familiar with that, and that probably was not a fair question. We dealt with many of those similar issues along the Gulf Coast because it's multi-million-dollar project, tens of millions of dollars sometimes, and it just takes time to do the studies to make sure you've identified the correct alternative, the most efficient, most effective alternative, and then, like you say, you've got to go through the next route of finding the resources to actually do the work. And then it takes time to do the work. Sometimes it can be 20 years from conception to completion for these large scale projects, but many of them are so incredibly important, and they're worth pursuing. So it's neat to hear about the work that y'all are involved in there. I did not realize that we were involved in some of that type work. So cool, and thanks for sharing. Amelia, I want to wrap up here by asking you about habitat conditions in the region. We've talked about the wetland management, the importance of wetlands in SONEC. They're primarily important as fall and spring migration staging areas, and notably in the spring when we talk about that flood irrigation that occurs on the ranchlands out there. And so as we think about those, if I've understood correctly, and think about the potential for wetland abundance, wetland quality in the spring, when that region is so important, we have to think about and look at snowpack as it may be occurring in winter and then into early spring, winter through early spring. So do you have some insights on what the snowpack is shaping up to be this winter?
Yeah, we've had pretty mild winters so far. There hasn't been a lot of snow on the ground. There's not a whole lot of snow in the mountains either. So we're hoping, in January, February, we get quite a bit more snow to, stabilize that snowpack and provide that, necessary runoff in the spring for those habitats. But it doesn't look like we have much at this point.
Water availability in these Intermountain West, in these arid regions, is quite a contrast to the way we think about it in the landscapes with which I'm most familiar, because in the Gulf Coast and in the lower Mississippi Valley, we don't depend on snow as a source of our water for wetland management. It comes primarily it comes in the form of rain, whether that be falling on the landscape and just inundating areas, or whether that be from overbank flooding of rivers and streams. So this idea of depending on snowpack and then that sort of being a storage, having storage capacity in the form of that snow, and then the dependence on that for the spring water abundance. It's a different concept for me, at least with respect to firsthand experience. And so it definitely brings with it some additional challenges, but nevertheless, we're dependent in these cases on the water that weather provides. And so this is you offered some interesting insights, and I hope our listeners are able to get a better picture for that region and some of the work that we do there, and why it's so important. So thank you for joining the show and sharing your insights.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
A special thanks to our guest on today's show, Amelia Raquel, a Ducks Unlimited biologist out in California working in the SONEC region. We also thank our producer, Clay Baird, who does a fantastic job editing these podcasts and getting them out to you, our listeners. And as always, to you, our listeners, we extend special thanks for sharing your time with us, and we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.